This was the toughest decision I had ever had to make. Do I throw away my entire future and become a mom? Or take life away before they even had a chance to live? I sat on the bathroom floor for hours, just hoping that this would all go away. I met my boyfriend when I was 15, and I thought he was the most amazing guy that I had ever met, and I felt so lucky to be with someone like him. But it wasn't too long until his true colors started showing. It started with little comments here and there like, "You look tired," or "You're putting on weight." Eventually, it turned into him dictating all aspects of my life. I was never allowed to do anything or talk to anyone without his approval. This went on for almost a year, and in that time, it felt like I wasn't even my own person. He physically and mentally tormented me. One day, he forced himself on me and somehow made me believe that I had asked for it. After he was done, I laid there and cried into my pillow, feeling weak, helpless, and empty. I thought about telling my parents, but he made me believe that they would disown me. He told me that no one else would love me, and even if I tried to tell someone what he was doing to me, no one would believe it. So I didn't say anything, and it kept happening. A week before our 1-year anniversary, my boyfriend broke up with me through text. He told me that he was sick of my neediness and that I was not good enough for someone like him. I cried, feeling like a loser, and I cried thinking he was the best I could ever get. But I also realized how lucky I was to have him out of my life. It was the best possible thing to happen, and that he could no longer hurt or be in my life. Then, one morning, I began to feel nauseous. I ended up vomiting, and at first, I thought I caught the flu or that it was stress from the breakup, but after a few days of this happening, I knew it wasn't the flu. I ran out and bought a pregnancy test and hoped it wasn't what I thought it was. I sat on the toilet waiting for the results, begging and hoping it wasn't true, but to my horror, it was positive. Why? How? I sat on the bathroom floor and cried until I couldn't anymore. I wasn't ready to be a parent. I'm only 15. How could he do this to me? I immediately called my cousin, who was an OBGYN, and told her everything. "Please help me. I don't know what to do." I cried on the phone. My cousin was the only person I could trust. She came as soon as she could, and 2 hours later, she pulled up to my driveway. She told me everything would be okay and took me to her clinic to confirm the pregnancy. She printed a report and took it to the nearest Planned Parenthood, where my cousin pretended to be my guardian so I could have the operation without my parents knowing. The first step was booking a mandatory therapy session for the next day. When we went back to Planned Parenthood, we were surrounded by people screaming and pushing photos of babies in our faces, calling us evil and selfish. I panicked, and the door and my cousin began to fade as everyone started to crowd around me. It felt like they were getting bigger and suffocating me with their yells. "Where's my cousin?" I thought to myself. I was beginning to get hysterical and felt sick. I pushed through the crowd and ran up the stairs, hoping to God that it would open. I got through and leaned against the wall, trying to calm my nerves, whispering, "It's going to be okay," to myself. I couldn't see my cousin anywhere, but a nurse touched me on the shoulder and said, "Right this way." She led me into a therapy room where a therapist was already sitting in a chair waiting for me. She had a stern look on her face. "Have a seat," she said while pointing to one right in front of her. I gulped and walked quietly to it. I could feel my heart racing. I wasn't ready for this. As soon as I sat down, the therapist said, "Think of your baby. Do you think you can live with yourself if you do this? Don't be selfish. Don't take life away." I tried to get a word out, but all I could say was, "Please, try to understand." Was the therapist right? But I'm only 15. I didn't want this. He forced himself on me, and I can't live with myself knowing someone like him is the father. I had to do this. I had to. While the therapist was talking, I stood up mid-sentence and yelled, "Please stop. I am going through with it." She sat there, stunned and quiet. At first, I was going to walk out, but the therapist looked at me apologetically and said, "I'm sorry if I came off too strong. Part of my job is to assess your mindset and make sure you're healthy enough to have the operation." I could tell she felt bad, so I said I would finish the therapy session and sat back into my chair. After a few more questions, she said I was able to continue and to make an appointment with the nurse out front. The nurse gave me 2 options: take a pill at home or come in for a non-invasive operation. I thought about taking the pill as I was only 3 weeks into my pregnancy, but the idea of doing it alone with my parents at home scared me. My parents had no idea what was happening, and if they knew, they would kick me out. So I decided to do the non-invasive procedure. The nurse said that it would only take a few hours and I could go home straight after. There wouldn't be any downtime and I wouldn't have to tell my parents anything. This was the only way for me. On the day of my operation, I sat in my cousin's car in complete silence. Was I a monster for doing this? I kept thinking to myself. I felt fear and shame building inside me. I turned to my cousin, asking her to hold my hand because I didn't want to go through the crowd of people alone. She gently held my hand and led me to the clinic, pushing through. We sat there for a while until they called my name. "The doctor will see you now." I turned to my cousin with fear in my eyes. Am I making the wrong decision? While I laid on the hospital bed, the nurse tried to reassure me and said that I was brave. I didn't believe her though. I was already 3 to 4 weeks pregnant, and even though that doesn't seem very far into a pregnancy, I was still carrying another life in my body. All I could do was stare at the ceiling and try not to cry. The doctor came over and started explaining what was going to happen and to try to relax. I was then given anesthesia. I started getting sleepy and then everything went black. The first thing I saw was my cousin standing over me. "You were so brave," she said as she helped me get dressed. On the way home, I started to get really nervous. How was I going to face my parents? I'd been lying to them the entire time. As I opened the door, my dad was sitting in the living room. "You're back! How was the mall?" I was trying to think of what to say. How could I tell my dad that his little girl had been physically tormented for months? And on top of that, she had gotten pregnant. All I could get out was, "It was fine, Dad," and ran as fast as I could to my room, knowing that I would never be able to tell him or anyone the truth. As I'm writing this, it has now been 2 months since I lost my baby. Sometimes when I'm alone, I think about the life I could have had. What would my baby be like? And how would my parents have reacted? Sometimes I wonder if the father would have cared. The week after the procedure was the hardest, and I couldn't stop crying. I couldn't eat anything. The only emotion I felt was shame for what I had done. Even with all these questions that still haunt me when I'm alone, I know that at the end of the day, I made the right decision for me. I was too young to even think about taking care of someone else, and I wouldn't have been able to live with myself if I gave up my baby for adoption. My ex-boyfriend knew exactly what he was doing and purposefully pulled the condom off that night and didn't even tell me. This was the only way I could go on, and I hope that one day I will be able to forgive myself for the decision I made. I know many of you will judge me as a horrible person no matter the reasons or situations, but I never intended for any of this at 15 years old. If you're going through a similar situation, I won't tell you what you should or should not do, but I'd like to say, know that you are not alone and that there is a way out. Talk to someone you can trust because no one deserves to have their consent taken away and made to feel like they are unlovable. And if you come to a difficult decision like mine, focus on what you feel is the best possible decision you can make overall.